This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. At the beginning of Lent, I invited people to have a complicated, complex Lent. Too often we're assaulted with various opinions from people and various strategies that make it sound like everything we're facing is really simple. And if you just knew this trick, it would all be fine. And as I said at the time, and I'd say today, I don't know about you, but my life doesn't work like that. And I don't think Lent necessarily works like that either. And today, it's getting even more complicated and more complex. Jesus is addressing the leaders of the church of his day, or at least one group of leaders of the church of his day. And he's challenging them. Now, the leaders were protecting particular traditions. As an Episcopalian, I've got to be in favor of at least some traditions, right? And I'm aware of the saying that says, what's tradition in the church is whatever the last rector did. But the traditions that Jesus is taking exception with the leaders about are things that probably made a certain amount of sense. If people wanted to give their the land of Palestine at that time was under the rule of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire had its own coinage, and so the coin of the realm had an image of the emperor on each coin. So if good people in the temple wanted to make an offering, they couldn't use that coin because it would be idolatrous. As a result, you had folks who changed the coin outside of the temple. They took the coin of the empire and turned it into the coin of the temple so that it could be offered with a clean conscience. Now, I don't know if I think this is where complexity starts, because so it's okay to use the coin of the empire as long as before anybody sees it in the temple, you've switched it out for something else. I think one might want to go a little deeper about how one engages and one participates or collaborates. But the leaders, this provided a particular function. In our church, we have traditions. You know, most of the traditions that we have in our church, I'm talking about very kind of church traditions about St. Paul's, are quite pragmatic. But over time, the pragmatic traditions are overlaid with a sense of sanctity far beyond their worth. So, for example, one of the things that I often nag about is about communion, about intinction. Letting people know that we'll dip for you. You don't need to dip for yourself. And there are people who feel very challenged by that. And it is not of any theological significance whatsoever. It's just pragmatic. We don't want your fingers in the chalice. It's not good for the people around you. It's really not good for you to have your fingers in the chalice. So we try to limit it. It is that practical. And if it doesn't happen exactly that way, the world is not going to end. The rector may have a heart attack, but the world is not going to end. So you may have heard this story before about the young newlywed who was preparing a ham. And so as she was getting ready to put it in the pan, she cut off the end and threw it away. And her spouse said, "Well, we don't make very much money. how can you afford to do that? And why are you doing that? She said, well, my mother always did that. And so they went and investigated with Mom. And Mom, why do you do this? She said, well, that's what my mother taught me to do. So thank God Grandma was still alive. So they got to Grandma and they said, Grandma, we've got this thing where you cut the end off the ham. Yeah. I said, why did you start that? Why did you do that? She said, oh, it didn't fit in the pan. Okay. So some traditions, some customs, some laws have very practical and useful origins. But sometimes they get used beyond what they were meant for. They get used longer than they were needed. I don't know if anybody has a tabulation of all of the laws that are still on the books, but nobody ever enforces anymore because they don't make sense when there's no horses on the street. There's just tons of laws like that. Well, these leaders were engaged in focusing on laws that had some significance, that were important, but their focus on these laws put them in a position where they were ignoring other things that were more important that were right in front of them. And I think that this is an incredibly important entry into Holy Week. Holy Week is not the time when we enter and we get to rag on all those bad people who did things to Jesus. What we get to do is we see how really good, faithful people extended traditions and customs and their own ideas to a place where they missed out on what God was actually asking them to do. And so Jesus engaged these leaders about it. And what did they want to know? Well, who gives you the authority to tell us this? Okay, answer me a question, then I'll answer your question. And of course, they couldn't spin the answer in a way that they thought was appropriate and would serve them, so they said, well, we don't know. So Jesus said, well, I don't know either. But here's what I'm telling you. Jesus was engaging them and inviting them to shift. Jesus was inviting them to be attentive to the fact that though these traditions might be good, God's actually talking to you about something else right now. God's calling you to something else. And I believe that's what entering into Holy Week is for us. We've got all the things. How many of you still have a Lenten discipline that you're managing to maintain? Okay, I won't ask which week. Okay, we have some. I won't ask which week the rest of you that it fell by the wayside. What if for Holy Week, the only thing that you had to do was to pay attention? What is God saying to me? What is God wanting me to do? What am I focused on that's keeping me away from seeing what God is talking to me about? This morning, none of you came early enough to figure this out, to see this, but when I got here this morning, there was a giant white station wagon parked out in front of the church. And I'm busy trying to get ready for Sunday morning, get ready, all of the things that are going on. And the first thought that I had when I saw this giant station wagon was, couldn't he have at least the courtesy to park it a little more forward so the rear end wasn't in the entry to the driveway? And I thought, I'm going to check something out. And I found that there was somebody sleeping in the back end of the station wagon. And I'm embarrassed that my first thought was, he's parked incorrectly. When the reality is that it's somebody who's in significant need. And there's not a happy ending to that story. It's just a point about me being reminded of what Holy Week is about, what any discipline, spiritual discipline is about. In the face of all the things we have to do, the complicated lives that we live, How do we remember each day, one day at a time, to pay attention to what's going on around us? For Jesus, he said, even tax collectors and prostitutes are figuring this out, but you church leaders aren't getting it. This Holy Week, take the time, take a breath, take a look around, listen. There are people who are hurting all around us. There are people who are hurting in this congregation this morning because of loss of jobs, loss of spouse. And pay attention. And then possibly be able to say a kind word. The first line in Isaiah, to lift up the weary with a word. And if we did that, if we paid attention, if we listened, if we noticed where God is calling us to care, to have a kind word, to make an effort, I think we'd walk right with Jesus through everything that's to come. And we'd be able to rejoice with him faithfully and with all our community on that Easter day. Amen.